Welcome to the American Battlefield Trust Gettysburg Remembrance Day 158 live series. We've already been around. We covered some of the, or we shared some of the ceremonies yesterday. We've shared some pictures and videos. We were with the 11th New Jersey, the Liberty Rifles, out on the Emmitsburg Road earlier. And here we are, sort of in the middle of the second day's battlefield. You're looking toward the Emmitsburg Road there, and Cemetery Ridge is directly behind the camera. That's Kris White behind the camera. I'm Garry Adelman. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you share this with your friends so we can, really spread the gospel of American history as much as possible. Now, July 2nd, 1863 is not going well for the Union in a lot of ways. The Southerners have launched the most powerful attack at Gettysburg. The largest attack at Gettysburg is not Pickett's charge, but rather it is the roughly 15,900 Confederate soldiers from Hood's division, McLaws' division, and Anderson's division, parts of two different corps, Longstreet and Hill, launched these attacks at now famous places: Devil's Den, Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and here, Cemetery Ridge, okay? And it is finally starting to warm up a little bit here. Let me take a key step here. I think it's getting up into the upper 30s already, so that's pretty good now. Gettysburg is crowded, by the way. It's Remembrance Day. There's a big parade here. There were Dedication Day ceremonies yesterday, so it's a great thing to be here for the anniversary and for these Remembrance Day activities, at least one point when you are able. Now let me back up for a quick second here, because July 2nd, 1863, I just went over it, Hood's division attacks, McLaws' division attacks, Anderson's division attacks, and that's all you really need to know for now about that. When Hood's division attacks, his brigades split up, commingle, the Confederates capture Devil's Den. They don't capture Little Round Top, but then they move into the wheat field. Eventually, with the help of McLaws' division, they capture the wheat field. They roll over the Peach Orchard. It's not going well for the Union. There's a massive gap in the Union line right where we stand. That gap is a third of a mile long. Let's pan, if we may, Kris, all the way over to those trees in the distance. That's part of Cemetery Ridge. It's also where the 20th Maine was positioned on the third day of the battle, not a half mile behind Kris at the angle like in the Gettysburg movie, okay? That gap continues all the way to this area behind me where you see the 1st Minnesota Monument over there and the Pennsylvania Memorial. Why is there a big gap here? Well, because when Dan Sickles moved his 3rd Corps out to the Emmitsburg Road behind the camera now, he took up a line that he didn't have enough men to man. He couldn't possibly do it. Meade realized, General Meade, commander of the Union Army, that he couldn't pull Sickles back. It was too late, and he will reinforce Sickles. And some of those reinforcements came from Culp's Hill, and a lot of them came from right here, a Union division. John C. Caldwell would have been in this general area. 4 brigades cross Kelly, Zook, and Brook. And those 4 brigades all move off toward the wheat field, leaving a yawning gap here. So after the Southerners roll over the Peach Orchard and Barksdale's Mississippians, and then Wilcox's Alabamians and Perry or Lang's Floridians are coming through this area, there are thousands of Confederates approaching, and there are 20 or 30 cannons formed to meet the threat. But, cannons can't really keep off troops too well. Henry Hunt and other artillerists might disagree, but in the end, it's like shooting mosquitoes with a rifle. Big cannons, little troops. You need foot soldiers to really fight foot soldiers in the end, okay? And that sets up one of the most famous scenes at Gettysburg, of course. It's a desperate moment. General Meade himself is trying to scramble reinforcements. Hancock, general commander of the 2nd Corps, is sending out 1 regiment, 2 regiments at a time to try to blunt this huge assault. By the way, beside Barksdale's Mississippians, Wilcox Alabamians, Lang's Floridians, followed by, and then you also have Wright's Georgians. So you've got thousands of Confederates as you get toward Anderson's division over here, really attacking in this area. The Union's doing everything they can. Hancock supposedly rides up to this area, okay, and he can't believe what he sees. 3,000 Confederates coming toward us, and 1 Union regiment formed to meet the threat. That's the 1st Minnesota. It's about an average size, just undersized regiment here, 282 men or 262 men here, formed right over there. And apparently he roars, "My God, is this all the men we have here?" And he decides he has to sacrifice them. And he is going to order a charge. Colonel Colville, 1st Minnesota, in a headlong charge into a much more numerically superior enemy. You can really decide how you want to count it. 3,000 Confederates are over there, but the Union also has some New Yorkers coming up here, okay? And both are going to be necessary. Willard's brigade of New Yorkers coming from Hayes's division of the 2nd Corps are not going to be able to get it done alone. And the 1st Minnesota can't possibly get it done alone. And I'm not even sure if both of them can get it done, but it will buy time. And in the end, that's what the famous charge of the 1st Minnesota is. And the 1st Minnesota, you know, when you came here 40 years ago, before the 20th Maine had risen to fame, these guys and the Iron Brigade were the famous Union units at Gettysburg. The 20th Maine, you know, with the Ken Burns series, with the Killer Angels book, with the Gettysburg movie, has really, you know, kind of came out as the best known Union regiment. But back in the day, the electric map talked about the 1st Minnesota, not the 20th Maine. So here we are, and we are going to recreate a little bit of this charge. We've already walked partway across the charge. The monument over here to the 1st Minnesota shows a man running on top of it, apparently in the direction in which they charged. And from what I can tell, it kind of works, and we'll talk about that as we get a little bit further in. All I'll say before we either start walking or I turn this over to Kris White behind the camera here is, you know, when told by Hancock whether or not he would charge that way, Hancock said, "Will you take those colors?" And Colville said, "I will try." And with that, the 262 men of the 1st Minnesota are going to move through this very field here. It's a noisy field, so when we start walking, we probably won't talk, and we'll probably encounter some difficulties with the terrain. The connectivity might actually cut out as we descend into the Cadore Swale, which is why we're starting over here and getting it started here. So we'll just see. If it cuts out, it cuts out, but we hope you enjoy. Kris?
We need to bring interns with us. So just throwing that out there. So if anyone wants to be our intern, we don't pay well and we're very abusive. So you can come out here and be Garry's camera person for the day. No, don't do that. I just want to point out a couple of things. First off, the monument behind me, I showed a picture of that a little bit earlier. That's to the 1st Minnesota. What you're seeing is that charge bayonets. So his rifle's at about a 45-degree angle, the bayonet mounted on top of it. So if you watch the movie Gettysburg, you would hear Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain say bayonets, simply go down the line. But they would have heard probably the order fix, which is your preparatory command, and then bayonets, which is your execution command. They would put the bayonets on and they would march down. They would exchange fire with the Confederates coming across here, who we'll talk about when we get down into the thick a little bit more. But as they go into the charge, you would hear the words charge, and then that would be your preparatory and bayonets. You drop it down, and you would hear a Yankee huzzah whenever they do that, or a tiger. This is the intimidation that they're trying to go out there with. Hancock, when he arrives here on July 1st of 1863, he really owns the field at Gettysburg when he comes up here onto East Cemetery Hill and starts to right that proverbial ship and try to put together that mess that Reynolds, Buford, and Howard really started on July 1st. On July 2nd, the guy's omnipresent. He's sending men to the south end of the field. He's making sure that as Dan Sickles moved forward and George Gordon Meade starts leaning on his junior-most corps commander whenever he took over the Army of the Potomac. He was number 7 of 7 of the infantry commanders. The only guy he outranked was Alfred Pleasanton. He is going to lean on this young officer who has risen now from division command. Then he's gone to corps, but guess what? He was basically a wing commander here at Gettysburg, commanding much of the Union left. So when he's out here, he's going to give very succinct orders. And one man said that even in civilian clothing, if he would go up to an Army officer, you would accept an order from Winfield Scott Hancock. He was that impressive, and he had that air of confidence around him. Men just kind of were a magnet to him. But out here, he will give some of the most succinct commands. One account says to Colonel Colville, he'll point towards the 5 Alabama flags of Cadmus Wilcox's brigade. Cadmus Wilcox, who we talked about in our last video, Uncle Billy Fixin, wearing a very short shell jacket, a big straw hat coming out here. West Point class of 1846, one of the most underrated combat leaders in the Army of Northern Virginia, if you ask me. He has 5 very solid Alabama regiments, and Hancock will say, "Do you see those colors, Colonel?" And he'll say, "Take them." and that's his command for Colville. So that's one of the commands he gave. There's all kinds of different accounts. My very favorite one I can't say, which he'll say to Arthur Devereux the next day during Pickett's charge. He uses some blue language, let's put it that way for a 19th century term, but he's very succinct when he tells Arthur Devereux to charge into the copse of trees. So I won't repeat that one here. So with that, what we're going to do is start marching our way down towards the Cadore Thicket. As Garry said, what is happening is John Caldwell's division has moved down towards the wheat field. We have fighting at Little Round Top starting to peter out a little bit. We have the fight in Devil's Den. Wheatfield is that whirlpool of death. And William Barksdale's brigade, if you watched our last video, is now pushed back the 11th New Jersey, pushed back Andrew Humphrey's division, and he is making his way towards us, as is Cadmus Wilcox's 5 Alabama regiments, as is David Lang's 3 Florida regiments, and then you'll have Rand's Wright, Ambrose Wright, a politician, bringing 4 Georgia regiments across. Unfortunately, they're going to come up for the Confederates. Unfortunately, they're going to come up a brigade or two too short. But we might talk about that in the Cadore Thicket.
3 things real quick. First of all, we've gotten some intern applications already, Kris, well done. We have some people that like some abuse too. We have 2 Minnesotans watching, one from Minnesota and one from Mexico City. And third, somebody said don't forget the Harpers Ferry Cowards. So Kris, just real quick, who are the Harpers Ferry Cowards and how do they work into this?
These poor Harpers Ferry Cowards, they're known as the Harpers Ferry Regiment to some folks. They were surrendered in September of 1862 in the largest surrender of United States forces up until that point in American history. In fact, up until the 1942 surrender at Corregidor. In the midst of the Gettysburg campaign, Joseph Hooker is he's our first Union commander, he's trying to get as many Union soldiers as possible from the Union High Command. And he keeps asking for these guys who are at Harper's Ferry. And Henry Halleck, the chief of the army, is basically saying, no, you can't have them. Then when George Gordon Meade takes over, he goes, you can have all the guys you want. That shows the old relationships between Hooker and Halleck were not that good. So what will happen is we'll start pulling in forces all around us as we start coming up towards Gettysburg. And eventually we have this group of men like the 39th New York, the Garibaldi Guard, who would have very large hats and plumes coming out of their hats. They would carry 3 regimental flags here rather than the standard issue of 2. And they spoke at least 4 different languages in that unit. You'd have the 125th, 126th New York. So these men would be coming across the field, and they were called the cowards because they were surrendered, really, according to some, without firing a shot to Stonewall Jackson in 1862, but they're out here for redemption. And what they're going to do is when they get their chance, they're going to come tearing down across these fields, charging up towards Barksdale's men, as well as Wilcox and Lang's Floridians, and some of them are going to go into the teeth of Edward Porter Alexander's guns, his artillery, and unfortunately for George Willard, commanding that brigade out here, he will be decapitated and killed instantly.
Pass it on to you, Kris, because a few things. First of all, another Minnesotan joined us. Welcome, Dennis, too. We got Sao Paulo, Brazil, so Mexico City. That wasn't quite far enough. We'll see if we can outdo Brazil in terms of who's watching. Our good friend Uli is watching, and of course JD from the History Underground. An unconfirmed report suggests that Kris from Vlogging Through History is also in town, so maybe we'll spot him. Again, we might lose connectivity. This is going to be loud, so we won't talk while we'll walk, so let's embark a little bit on the charge of the 1st Minnesota.
And if we lose connectivity, I'll post the full video later.
Good. You go in front, so... So, we have a map where we can see what was growing in each and every field at the time. I can't remember what this one is. Something tells me this might have been wheat, but I can't exactly remember. There was a lot of timothy, hay, and stubble field, but it wouldn't have been this sort of nasty. It was July. This field was farmed in one way or another, so and it really hadn't been trodden yet. There had certainly been some skirmishers out this way, but I don't think it would have been nasty like what we just walked through just there. As I remember, Kris might want to talk a little bit about this charge. Before we do, let me just say, without telling the whole story, that two of the people in the charge, we have one of the best photos of the Civil War. I know Kris also has it on Switcher here, so he might pull it up, but this is Patrick and Isaac Taylor of the 1st Minnesota. They are both going into this charge. One of them keeps a diary. You may have read some of words from both of them that appear in the diary in Richard Moe's book, The Last Full Measure. But this is surely a full-length, beautiful tintype of two identified people, in this case of the 1st Minnesota. Just one of the great photos, great portrait photos of the Civil War. I'll tell a little bit more about this story a little bit later. This tintype is in the holdings of the Gettysburg National Military Park. Now, Kris, I think you had something to say about the charge here. Do I remember that properly? What would this have looked like at this point?
I'd just like to talk about the 1st Minnesota, as some folks will call it when you're joking around on a battlefield a little bit. And it's okay to be have a little levity out here. Believe me, these guys had some senses of humor on them. But the 1st Minnesota is the first federal regiment to actually enter federal service. It gets a little confusing on, who's a militia officer and who's a 90-dayer and who's this and who's that. Well, the 1st Minnesota will arrive in Washington, D.C. shortly after the firing of Fort Sumter, offering their service to President Abraham Lincoln. We'll see a lot of action during the American Civil War in the Eastern Theater. They're the only Minnesota regiment to fight here at Gettysburg. Their former brigade commander, he's one of the guys with my favorite name, Napoleon Bonaparte Tecumseh. Dana was his name, awesome name. But these guys would see action on the Peninsula Campaign, in the West Woods at Antietam. So they've seen some fighting before they arrived here at Gettysburg. But what drives me nuts about Hollywood, and this is what I kind of want to go back to. Eric Wittenberg and I were having a discussion a few years ago about charges in historical movies. You watch the movie Gods and Jackson, and you will have these guys. Yes, it's Gods and Jackson to me. You will have Jeb Stuart making this charge, and you see them. It's like they're riding hard for the Union. Then you shoot to the Union, like they're kind of sitting there. Then you turn back to Stuart, charge, and then you look back at the Union guys again, and charge. And these guys are riding forever. Keep in mind, we're dealing with humans, and we're sometimes dealing with horses in these charges. So there's actually a protocol to charging across these fields. You're not going to start running from Cemetery Ridge and try to get all the way down into the Confederates who might be a half mile away from you. We're not talking about athletes here. These guys were in great shape, but what will happen is they'll start usually at a march, and then they'll go to the double quick, which is a slow jog. It is not a run like a lot of people think. And then once you start zeroing in on an enemy, you might stop and unleash a volley and then charge into them. Or you might just keep that momentum going, level those bayonets, and go forward. Hand-to-hand fighting is a rare thing in the American Civil War. We do see a lot of it in the wheat field, and especially over on East Cemetery Hill here at Gettysburg, but it is a rare thing to use that bayonet. Only 3% of all wounds inflicted during the Civil War come from that bayonet. Then whenever you look at the Cav out here, charging across East Cav Field, they're going to start across the field at a walk, then a trot, and then they'll wait till maybe 40 or so yards away from the enemy. Then they will start to charge, because you don't want to start charging 4 or 5 football fields away, because by the time the horses meet with the enemy, they're going to be exhausted, as will the riders at that point. So keep in mind, when we're starting to talk about these charges, don't believe everything you see in movies. These are humans, these are horses, and believe me, they have limitations.
Good, excellent, Kris. And before I give this camera back to Kris, I just want to point out a few things to orient you. That is the Kadori barn. The barn is not original. The house is, except the house next to it right there has been expanded since the battle. It was much smaller at the time, but those are along the Emmetsburg Road. You might be able to see the large Vermont State Memorial, or Stannard's Brigade Monument, I specifically mean, the Pennsylvania Memorial, and of course the 1st Minnesota Monument that we already talked about. And I'm looking along Cemetery Ridge stage here. The sun's going to brighten things up a little bit. The sun tends to do that. And now I'm looking toward the round tops. The pointy hill on the right, of course, is Big Round Top, and the little one to the left is Little Round Top, appropriately named indeed. And we're looking at the Kadori Thicket, and I think we're about to walk a little further, but let me hand it back to Kris and say one more thing here. What was it? Well, first of all, we got another Minnesotan joining us. We have two people from Canada, including Jean-Francois, who's doing a birthday fundraiser for us. Thank you very much. And since he told me I pronounced it properly, I'm just going to keep saying Jean-Francois all the time, going back to my middle school French classes, if I may. And I think I had a few other things to say, because we have so many friends watching. Make sure you share this with your friends. We're the American Battlefield Trust. We preserve Battlefield, and we educate the public and hopefully inspire that public about the first 100 years of American history and why Battlefield and that history matters. So, Kris, if nothing else, let's keep walking. You know, we talk about living witnesses a lot, but people forget, of course, that these rocks are witnesses. I mean, does anybody have a doubt, given the direction of the charge, that the men of the 1st Minnesota not only charged across this field, but came upon these rocks here? There are specific rocks that they reached in the woods that we won't be able to see today. It's too boggy, and they're really hard to find, trust me. But they're out there. And the veterans came back and pointed to some boulders and took pictures there and said, this is the farthest point of our charge. If I'm correct, this is where Colonel Colville was first wounded. So, you know, these rocks are very important signposts. I think you know that, for both photographs and for historical accounts. We're doing the charge of the 1st Minnesota. You're with the American Battlefield Trust.
And what you're seeing on your screen are some of the veterans of the 1st Minnesota, called the survivors of the charge, that came back here to Gettysburg.
I think there's a break in the fence up there. Let's see if we can easily get over it here, or we'll look for a break. No, we are not climbing the fence. I'm going to step over it and then grab the camera from Kris. I'm going to skirt this off to the right here, show you where we came from. Here we are at one of the more rarely visited monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield. Most people don't even know it's here, you know, and it's a little bit hard to find, especially in the summer. But of course, if you can't see it, this is the monument to the Minnesotans charged, specifically to their brigade commander, George Willard, who suffered an artillery shell hit to the head while he was leading his men forward. So here we have the commingling, sort of the 1st Minnesota story and that of the Harper's Ferry cowards. And as somebody already posted, they weren't cowards this day, and that is true. These guys were looking for redemption. They were looking to salvage their reputation, unfairly given in the first place, by the way, if you ask me. But these guys guys were coming forward. Their regiments were splitting up. This is a pretty large brigade with some large regiments in it. First, they're over in that direction, and then some of them are moved over in this direction, while the 1st Minnesota is actually continuing off in that direction. But as for George Willard here, I mean, this guy looks like Matthew Broderick in the Glory movie. He's that kind of a look. I think he's in his 20s. I can't remember his exact age. Kris, I think he might be 27 here or something like that.
I think he's 26 or 27.
Yeah, and he's a colonel, and here he is memorialized out here in the Kadori Thicket again. You know, the first monuments on the battlefield here outside the National Cemetery were to where people fell. It wasn't simply natural for people to place regiment, brigade, and state memorials at the time. The first monuments on this battlefield to, say, Colonel Fred Taylor and to Colonel then General posthumously Strong Vincent and to Henry Merwin and other people, you know, to where people fell. And this one wasn't one of the earliest ones, but this one was put right over here. Anything to add, Kris, before we go over toward the 1st Minnesota sector?
So just to orient folks, so we have coming up kind of in this direction from the southwest will be William Barksdale's men. They're starting to lose steam. They have broken the Peach Orchard. They've engaged with the 9th Massachusetts Battery down by the Trossel Farm. They've rolled up the Emmitsburg line, road line, and as William Barksdale starts to come down into some of these swales, he is going to be felled by some federal troops. Eventually, his body will be taken from the battlefield back to the Hummelbaugh farm, which still exists. It's along Hunt Avenue today. And if you want to see what that looks like, what the Hummelbaugh farm will look like, and the death scene of William Barksdale, who will die on July 3rd, and there's a fantastic account of a musician in the 148th Pennsylvania who takes care of Barksdale in his final hours. You can download the American Battlefield Trust app that we have for our augmented reality, and it'll take you right back into time through your cell phone, just standing out there looking around, and you can engage there. And it's something that I rarely do. I wrote about it in my book, Don't Give an Inch. What I rarely do is plug my own books, but it's one of my favorite stories to tell. And there's a great quote from the 33rd New York who talked about William Barksdale. They said, "The haughty and supercilious Barksdale bled out on the crimson fields of Gettysburg without even a slave to bring him a cold cup of water." And I always like to talk about how, yes, he may not have had a slave here to give him a cold cup of water, but there was a musician, Robert Cassidy, of the 148th Pennsylvania, who was tending to him in his final hours. So in the irony of them trying to kind of bring William Barksdale down a notch, there's a real story of humanity there at the end of his life. So take a look at that account, and it might be over on Emerging Civil War as well. I think I put it up there. So Barksdale goes down. Then we have coming across the field will be Wilcox's men, Alabamians, and then we'll have Floridians coming across here. There's a man who comes across this field named Lewis Payne, also known as Lewis Powell. You may have heard that name, and there's a very famous picture of him in the United States Navy Yard down in Washington, D.C., because he is the man who will attack William Seward with basically a Bowie knife the night that John Wilkes Booth assassinates Abraham Lincoln. He is wounded out here, Powell is, or Payne, on the Gettysburg battlefield. And if you look back a few years, we actually saw that artifact at the Huntington Library out in California. So you could check out that video as well. So we have that connection here to the Lincoln assassination. But Cadmus Wilcox is going to complain, and something that Garry and I were discussing before we came over here, and that was, where are these generals? We don't always know where they are in a battlefield. And Wilcox, after the battle, is going to complain about his boss, Richard Heron Anderson, a division commander out here. He's going to claim Anderson never crossed the Emmitsburg Road. So when the 1st Minnesota hit Wilcox's men and they start coming down to push them back, Wilcox is going to start blaming his boss for not bringing up timely reinforcements. Was that the case? Was it the case that these small Minnesota regiment actually blunted these 5 Alabamians? It's a little bit of pride. So think about that for a moment. It might be pride coming out there. It might be reality. But regardless, we don't always know where everyone is. And finally, up off to my left, going towards what we call the high water mark, will be Ambrose Wright's 4 Georgia regiments, who will break the Union center. And the next day, whenever they're contemplating Pickett's charge, Wright is going to say something along the lines of, "It's easy to get there. Staying there is the hard part." So that's what it's looking like out here.
And let me just say that while this is happening, it's not like Hancock said, okay, Willard's Brigade is here, I'm sending in the 1st Minnesota, everything's okay. No, 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 no. They are scrambling whatever artillery and infantry they can. Here comes 1st Corps soldiers. Here comes some of the Vermonters coming up, which hadn't been involved in the first day's fight. Here comes whatever group of soldiers they can find, because this is the great emergency for the Union on July 2nd. There's going to be another one on Culp's Hill. There's going to be another one on East Cemetery Hill, but this one had the real opportunity, I guess a few of them, to cause real disaster in the Union Army. If the Confederates actually really cut the Union Army in two here, wouldn't have been good. They control the Taneytown Road. Maybe they can move on to the Baltimore Pike. And maybe some actions on the Union right, the Confederates could have had similar results. Now, we want to finish this up, so let's move over a little bit. According to the survivors of the 1st Minnesota, who came out here and were photographed, we're not going to go all the way out there, but we want to give you a look of the terrain. It was further over and to the south. So we'll just take a few more steps over here to get more into that sector. By the way, what I meant by a few steps is about 150 steps to get there. Now, maybe at the end we'll push through there and you can actually see a little further, but let's tie up the story here. Just, I don't know how well we can get through some of this. It looks kind of thick, but by every account, by the accounts I've seen, not only where the soldiers came to and where those rocks are that can still be found today in their pictures, but by their accounts, they got about to Plum Run. In other words, to the bottom of this swale. And you might be able to see it's still descending at this point. And by this time, by the time they get there and from their retreat, they're going to suffer famously. 82% of their men, I think 239 of them, will be killed or wounded or captured. It's known generally as the costliest charge of the Civil War. The 1st Texas at Antietam might disagree with you there. Some of the 11th Corps units on the first day, who might have suffered a lot of captured, but also that is counted as a casualty, might disagree with that. There are numerous units actually with a greater regimental loss at Gettysburg than the 1st Minnesota, but this one was in a single charge, an outnumbered charge. It's a great story, and again, I know that there's another fan of Richard Moe's book out there. It's a really good telling of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 2 of the soldiers in the charge. I mentioned earlier, too, that Colonel Colville is wounded, and most of them are killed or wounded during this charge. But you have Patrick and Isaac Taylor. I confess I get them confused. I believe it is Patrick on the left and Isaac on the right. And either way, if I might be switching the names, it's the guy with the dark beard who actually kept a diary, and I think that's Patrick. And Patrick was keeping that diary. He had an entry during the battle, or more than one, and then the next entry is written in a different pen, and it is that of his brother writing the final entry in the diary. And that diary is, the owner of this diary was killed in a charge on July 2nd at Gettysburg. The living brother buried the dead brother, and then that diary, continued on, and Richard Moe uses it a lot in his book. Now, sad as that is, there's a sad story of the photograph as well, because this is obviously, like I said, a beautiful photo. Most regiments would be, so pleased to have several of these for their particular unit. And so captivating was it that William A. Frazanito, the photo historian, back in the 70s or 80s, made a photographic copy, I think it was in the 70s, of this. And not long after that, at some point, this tintype went missing from the park's archives. It was gone. It was gone all the way through the 90s, during which William Frazanito wrote in his book. He published this photo, not quite full length, so that the owner, so that it could be distinguished, in case it ever came about again, and urged whoever had it to return it. And incredibly, 11 years after his early photography at Gettysburg came out, on a day I happened to be at the park, April 24th, 2006, collecting pictures for the museum, the high-res pictures, they received this package with this note. Recently came to our understanding that this photo may belong to the park, its collection. It was located in the effects of a former deceased relatives with many apologies to ... all. And in that was the tintype, which we were able to scan properly, use in the museum, and that we can share with you today. So just because we have a photo, it doesn't mean that the story of the Taylor brothers is any more important, but it's a visual link, you know, sort of to their families' sacrifice here at Gettysburg. And if you just imagine if there were 230 plus people killed, wounded, captured here, I just showed you a picture of 2 of them. I mean, and that's just one regiment of the hundreds at Gettysburg. But the story of the 1st Minnesota does indeed endure. I do want to walk through there a little bit and see if we can get through. But Kris, anything to add at this point? Let's see if we can slip through. Watch your step, please. I'll bet most of you have not stood here before, okay? Somewhere right in that thicket is the extreme point of their charge. That's where Plum Run is. Somewhere along that run are the rocks they said they got to. I don't even know if we're still rolling, but thank you so much for watching. Thanks to Kris for the intrepid camera work. Thanks for all the great comments. Share this with your friends, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.